On his birthday, a father froze when his own son sneered. "The best gift would be if you just died," words so cruel they sliced through the air like a blade. The decorations sat untouched, the quiet house suddenly colder than any winter night, and the man who had sacrificed everything was left staring at the child he no longer recognized. The betrayal was raw, unforgivable, and it turned a day of joy into a wound that would never heal. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you're watching from. What he chose to do next would silence them all. The father sat in the dim light of his living room, the faint scent of old oak still rising from the beams he had polished countless times over the years. The tick of the wall clock echoed through the silence like a metronome marking the slow unraveling of his life. The house once alive with voices, laughter, and the chaos of family dinners felt hollow, stripped bare of warmth, its emptiness pressing down on him like a weight. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the framed photographs that lined the mantel. Each one told a story of sacrificed birthdays. He had worked double shifts to afford holidays, when he pawned his watch to put gifts beneath the tree. Graduations where his cheers were drowned out by the applause of strangers. Every memory was soaked in devotion, every image a reminder of the years he gave without asking for anything in return. Now those same years stared back at him with a cruel irony. All that love, all that labor had bought him nothing but contempt. The living room was silent except for the sigh of the wind against the windows, but in his head he could still hear his son's words, sharp and unforgiving. The phrase looped endlessly, cutting deeper each time until it became a chant, a brand seared into his mind. He gripped the arm of his chair, feeling the fabric bite into his palm, wishing he could claw the sound out of his skull. The boy he once cradled, the boy he once carried on his shoulders through county fairs and ball games, had spoken as though his father's existence were nothing but a burden. A man can survive poverty, illness, even war, but the betrayal of blood. That is a wound no bandage can mend. He rose and walked slowly through the house, his steps heavy on the hardwood floor. The hallway smelled faintly of dust and lemon cleaner, but beneath it lingered the scent of Sunday roasts. His late wife used to prepare a ghost of a home that no longer existed. He paused at the door to his son's old bedroom, now nothing but bare walls and the shadows of posters long torn down. He could almost see the boy kneeling by the bed, whispering secrets into the dark, his little league glove tossed carelessly in the corner, a half-finished science project spread across the desk. He had stayed up those nights, guiding, helping, promising a world that was supposed to be better, and now standing in the emptiness, he wondered if every promise he made had only fed the cruelty that had grown in his son's heart. The father returned to the living room, sat again, and closed his eyes. His mind wandered back to the years when he worked construction in the blazing summer heat, the thermometer always pushing past 90 degrees, his hands blistered from handling steel beams. He remembered the winter mornings when he left before sunrise, ice cracking under his boots to plow snow so he could cover the bills. He had done it all without complaint, believing the future he was building for his son was worth every bruise, every scar. That same future now mocked him from across the years, for the man who once called him Dad now spoke of him as if he were nothing but dead weight. A hollow ache spread through his chest, but along with the ache came clarity. Loneliness was no stranger to him. He had met it on the road in motel rooms while working jobs away from home, and he had tasted it again after his wife's passing. But this was different. This loneliness carried shame, the cruel suggestion that he had failed, that his very presence was a mistake. The walls seemed to whisper it back at him. The floor creaked it beneath his feet. Even the silence agreed. He sat perfectly still, afraid that if he moved, the hollowness inside would spill over and drown him. Hours passed. The sun slid across the sky, its light cutting through the blinds in harsh lines, painting stripes across his tired face. Outside, neighbors laughed faintly. Children rode bikes along the street, their voices carried on the late afternoon air. Life went on beyond his walls, vibrant and careless, while inside he felt himself dissolving into a shadow. He reached for the glass of water on the side table, but even that tasted foreign, as if the world itself had turned its back. He whispered into the stillness, though no one was there to hear. "What did I do so wrong?" The words hung in the air, unanswered, a prayer without a God. His gaze drifted back to the mantel, to the photos again. One in particular, a picture of him holding his son at age 5, the boy wrapped in a baseball jersey 2 sizes too big, both of them smiling with dirt-streaked faces after a long game in the park. He reached up and touched the frame, his fingers trembling. That smile, that trust, that bond, they had been real once. He was certain of it. Where had it gone? Had he been blind, too eager to believe that love was unbreakable? The shame twisted deeper, pulling at his ribs, but beneath it all, something else stirred. It was not rage, not yet. It was not even defiance. It was something colder, quieter, like ice forming slowly on a winter pond. He straightened in his chair, no longer slouched, his spine stiff, his jaw clenched. The humiliation, the rejection, the loneliness, they were shaping into resolve. His son's words had cut him, but they had also revealed something dangerous. They had shown him that his kindness had been mistaken for weakness, his silence mistaken for surrender. That would not stand. The father stood once more, his shadow stretching long across the floor as evening settled in. He walked to the window and pulled the blinds aside, staring out at the street where cars glided by, their headlights slicing through the dark. The neighborhood looked ordinary, but inside his chest, nothing was ordinary anymore. He felt the sting of betrayal transform into something steadier, sharper. His lips pressed into a thin line, his breath even. He whispered to the empty house, though the words were for himself alone. "This isn't over." And as the night deepened, as the clock ticked on, and the house sank further into silence, the father's heart no longer felt hollow. It felt heavy, yes, but heavy with purpose. He had been treated like a man already gone, erased from his own life. But he was far from gone. And when the time came, his son would learn that the father he dismissed so easily was not a ghost, not a burden, but a storm waiting on the horizon. What he prepared to do next would turn the silence of that night into an echo his son would never forget. The words kept striking him long after they were spoken, like a hammer landing blow after blow inside his skull. He sat in the darkened room, every syllable replaying with surgical precision, cutting deeper with each return. The voice of his own son, not a stranger, not an enemy, but the boy he once lifted onto his shoulders, now reduced to venom. The humiliation seared him more than any wound to the flesh could. He had built a life brick by brick, poured sweat into foundations, bled on scaffolding, endured nights of aching muscles, all so his son could live with choices he never had. And yet in the space of a single sentence, his son had erased it all, as though decades of devotion were worth less than dust. He pressed his palms against his thighs, leaning forward, trying to steady his breathing. But the shame spread through him like fire, relentless, creeping into every corner of his body. He saw it in the mirror across the room, the slump of his shoulders, the tired lines carved into his face, the hollow look in his eyes. Was this what his son saw? A man stripped of value, a burden to be discarded? The question gnawed at him, bitter and corrosive. His chest tightened, the pain not sharp but heavy, a weight that refused to lift. He thought of the times he had stood proudly in front of his coworkers talking about his boy. The way he used to beam when someone asked how his son was doing at school, how he bragged when the acceptance letter arrived, how he worked overtime to make sure every tuition payment cleared without delay. Each memory now twisted into a mockery. To think he once carried those stories like medals, only to have them spat on by the very person they were meant for. The humiliation was not just private. It infected his sense of who he was in the eyes of the world. The sound of laughter drifted faintly from outside neighbors gathered on their porches, enjoying a cool evening. He imagined them learning what had been said, imagined their pitying looks, the hushed whispers, the old man whose son wished him dead. The thought clawed at him, stoking the quiet rage that brewed beneath the shame. For a man like him, reputation had always been everything. Respect was the currency he traded in, not wealth, not luxury. And now, in a single cruel phrase, even that had been stolen. He stood and paced the floor, each step a restless strike against the wood. The house groaned under his movement as if echoing his unrest. He whispered to himself, not even sure if the words were audible. "After everything I gave, after everything I built." His voice cracked, a mix of disbelief and fury, a man trying to reconcile the unthinkable. But no matter how many times he repeated it, no explanation surfaced. There was no reason, no justification that could soften the blow. The humiliation cut so deep because it came not from a moment of anger, not from a drunken slip of the tongue, but from clarity. His son had looked at him with steady eyes and meant it. There had been no hesitation, no flicker of regret, only certainty. That certainty was what hollowed him out most of all. He pressed his fist against his chest as if he could physically push back the ache growing inside. The air in the room felt thick. His lungs reluctant to expand, his heart laboring against the weight of betrayal. He turned toward the window, watching the streetlights flicker on their glow, staining the pavement in pale gold. The world outside moved on, as if nothing had happened, while inside he was unraveling. He remembered standing beneath similar lights years ago, waiting for his son after football practice, bringing hot chocolate in a thermos to keep him warm on cold nights. He remembered cheering from the sidelines, calling out encouragement until his voice went raw. All those nights under the lights, all those sacrifices had collapsed into this single humiliation. A son who now measured his father's worth as less than nothing. The bitterness hardened into silence. He sank back into his chair, no longer fighting the ache but letting it settle into him like stone. He imagined how his wife, if she were alive, would have reacted. She would have defended him, stood between father and son, demanded respect. The absence of her voice now deepened the shame. He was alone, to carry it alone, to feel the sting without shield or solace. The walls of the house, once alive with her presence, seemed to lean closer, trapping him with the echo of his disgrace. He clenched his jaw, grinding his teeth until his head throbbed. The humiliation wasn't fleeting. It wasn't a moment that could be brushed aside with time. It had carved itself into him, permanent, a scar that would not fade. He knew this truth as he sat there. He would never forget it. The betrayal was etched into his memory, replaying each time he closed his eyes, a reminder that love, no matter how fierce, was never enough to guarantee loyalty. The night deepened. The house was silent except for the relentless tick of the clock, each second dragging him further into the abyss of shame. Yet even as the humiliation weighed down on him, something else stirred beneath it. Not forgiveness, not surrender, but a slow-burning resolve. He would not let those words define him forever. The sting in his chest was unbearable, but it carried with it the spark of something sharper, something that would not remain buried for long. And as he sat in the darkness, staring at the faint reflection of his own weary face in the glass, he knew the story was far from over. What his son believed was the end of a father's worth was only the beginning of something far more dangerous. What he prepared to do next would transform humiliation into a reckoning his son never saw coming. He closed his eyes, and the years rolled back like film reels turning in a dusty projector. The present darkness faded into the blinding glare of sun on steel beams, the suffocating heat of summer days that never dipped below 95 degrees. He could still feel the sting of sweat running into his eyes, the grit of cement dust clinging to his skin, the ache in his back after 10 hours on a construction site where every hour meant survival. His hands had long ago lost the softness of youth, hardened into tools themselves, calloused and scarred. Those hands had built not only houses for strangers, but the fragile scaffolding of a better future for his son. He remembered driving home in a truck that coughed smoke from its tailpipe, his lunch pail empty, his boots caked in mud. Sometimes he would park 2 blocks away, just so the neighbors wouldn't see him pause in exhaustion, forehead pressed against the steering wheel, gathering the strength to walk inside. But he always walked in smiling. His son would be waiting, books scattered across the table, asking about math problems or science projects. The fatigue never mattered then. He'd sit down, rub his temples, and explain equations until the boy's eyes lit up with understanding. Those nights were worth more than any paycheck, or so he had believed. There had been winters when the heating bill swallowed half his wage when he pulled extra shifts shoveling snow off frozen work sites just to keep the house warm. He remembered layering his son's bed with blankets, tucking him in, pretending not to notice the frost gathering at the edges of the window. He went without new coats, new shoes, meals even, but his son never lacked. That was the silent oath he had carried. The boy comes first. Always. When college applications arrived, he worked until his joints screamed. He remembered cashing out his small savings, the envelope of dollars handed to the bursar's office, with fingers that shook from more than fatigue. Each semester paid was a victory wrestled from pain. When his son drove off in his first car, a rust-red sedan bought with money scraped from overtime shifts, the father had stood on the curb, pride swelling in his chest despite the empty wallet in his pocket. He waved until the car disappeared, believing he was waving at the future he had promised. The wedding came years later, and again he paid. He sold tools he still needed, dipped into his retirement, even skipped mortgage payments to cover the catering bills. He remembered lifting a glass at the reception, his throat thick with pride as he watched his son take vows beneath a string of glowing lights. The music, the laughter, the crowd, all of it had blurred into a haze of joy. He had thought then that it was all worth it. Every blister, every sacrifice, every long night away from home. He believed he had secured his son's happiness. And now, with one sentence, the son had discarded it all. The words cut sharper because they didn't just insult the present. They rewrote the past. All those sacrifices now felt meaningless, tossed aside like scraps on a workbench. The father pressed his thumb into the ridge of an old scar across his palm, a reminder of the beam that had slipped years ago, splitting skin to the bone. He had wrapped it in tape, finished the day's work, and never told anyone. That scar was a symbol of what he gave silently. But what was it now except proof of a devotion his son refused to acknowledge? He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, tracing the water stains from an old leak he had patched himself. Every mark in that house was a testament to his labor, his stubborn refusal to quit. Yet the man who lived there was spoken of as though he were useless, disposable. The humiliation burned hotter when measured against the ledger of sacrifice. He had mortgaged his youth, his health, his very identity to give his son the chance to stand taller, richer, freer. And now that same son had weaponized his existence against him, as if his survival itself were an inconvenience. His breathing slowed, his eyes narrowing as if focusing on an enemy across a battlefield. Betrayal always hurts, but betrayal measured against sacrifice that was unbearable. He pictured his son in that shiny car walking across the polished floors of the wedding hall, holding the diploma that had cost him years of toil. Each image stacked against the echo of those words, "Better if you just died." It was as though the son had taken every gift, every sacrifice, and smashed it back into his father's face. The room grew darker, shadows lengthening across the floor, but the memories kept coming sharper now, more relentless. Nights when he had driven through rainstorms with tools rattling in the back mornings, when his hands were too stiff to tie his laces, but he forced them anyway because the job had to be done. The sacrifices had been invisible at the time, taken for granted by the boy who never saw the exhaustion behind the smile. And perhaps that was the deepest wound of all, that the sacrifices were unseen, unappreciated, erased not by time but by cruelty. He rubbed his temples, but the images refused to leave. He was a man drowning in his own history, pulled under by memories that should have been anchors of pride but had become weights of humiliation. His chest ached with the pressure of it, each heartbeat a reminder of the debt his son had repaid with disdain. The shame and betrayal coiled tighter, but beneath them something else stirred again, that cold, quiet resolve he had felt earlier, now gaining strength. He opened his eyes, staring into the darkness as though it were a mirror. The sacrifices were real, carved into his flesh and his memory, but they would not define him as weak. If anything, they would become the foundation for what came next. Because a man who has given everything and been discarded has nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing to lose can be more dangerous than his son could ever imagine. What he was preparing would not erase the years of sacrifice, but it would ensure those sacrifices were never forgotten again. The thought pressed against his ribs like a blade he couldn't pull free. Betrayal. Not from a stranger, not from some rival, but from the blood he had carried, the boy whose first cries had once filled him with wonder. The word itself seemed too small for what he felt. This wasn't just ingratitude. It was treason against everything a family was supposed to mean. He stared at the framed photo on the table, his son at 10 years old, arms draped around his neck after a baseball game. Dirt streaked on his cheeks, a grin so wide it had erased every ounce of fatigue. How could that boy, that same boy, grow into the man who looked him in the eye and said he'd be better off dead? The father's hand trembled as he set the frame down. His breath caught between grief and fury. The trust he had once placed in his son was absolute. He had believed with a conviction stronger than steel that no matter what storms life hurled at him, his family would be the anchor that kept him steady. But now that anchor had been cut loose, leaving him adrift in waters darker than any he had known. His chest tightened as he whispered to the silence, "How could my own flesh betray me like this?" The words were swallowed by the room, but the silence that followed seemed to agree, seemed to echo. "He has turned against you." He thought of all the quiet promises he had made over the years, not out loud but in the marrow of his being. Promises that his son would never know hunger, never face the kind of cold nights he himself had endured as a child. Promises that his son would always have someone to lean on, someone to catch him when he stumbled. He had kept those promises faithfully, each sacrifice a brick in the foundation of trust. And yet with one vicious sentence that foundation had crumbled into dust. The betrayal felt physical, a weight lodged deep in his chest. It made each breath sharp, each heartbeat a reminder of what had been broken. He tried to summon anger, something fiery that might consume the shame, but what rose instead was darker. It was a hollowness that stretched wide, swallowing the pride he once carried as a father. His son's cruelty hadn't just wounded him. It had rewritten the very definition of who he was in his own eyes. If the man he raised could see him as disposable, then what had his life meant? He turned toward the window, his reflection staring back faintly in the glass. The face that looked at him seemed older than it had hours before, weighed down not by years, but by disillusionment. He thought of his own father, a man who had taught him that family was sacred, that blood was thicker than anything else. He had lived by that code, bent his back to it, bled for it. And now staring into that reflection he wondered if he had been a fool. Maybe the code had died with the generation before him. Maybe loyalty meant nothing anymore. But the thought of surrendering to that idea burned his throat. No, he had not been a fool. He had been betrayed. The difference mattered. Betrayal carried with it a choice, a chance to respond, to reclaim what had been stolen. And though his heart ached with the loss of trust, something else stirred beneath the grief. A dangerous clarity. He replayed his son's face in his mind, the cold certainty in his eyes. That was not the boy he raised, not the boy who once clung to his leg on the first day of school, terrified of being left behind. Somewhere along the way, something had twisted, reshaped him into a stranger wearing his son's skin. The father's jaw clenched. If blood could betray, then blood could also be reminded. The betrayal was complete, but it was not the end. It was a beginning he had not asked for, but one he would claim. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the house heavy with silence, the father sat straighter in his chair. The shame and grief remained, but they were no longer chains. They were fuel, feeding a resolve as sharp as glass. He whispered once more into the room, the words, steady this time, no longer a question, but a promise. "You think I am nothing. You'll see who I really am." And as the night swallowed the house, he already knew the next step would change everything. The silence spread through the house like smoke, thick and suffocating, clinging to the walls until even the creak of the floorboards seemed afraid to break it. He sat in his chair, back straight, jaw set, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Not a word escaped his lips. Not a single sound betrayed the storm rising inside him. To anyone looking in, It might have seemed like defeat, the weary slump of an old man too tired to fight. But beneath the stillness lay something far more dangerous. His silence was not surrender. It was strategy. His son's words still echoed, but now they no longer rang like a hammer against his skull. Instead, they sank into him deep and cold, buried where anger hardens into resolve. Shouting would have given his son power, would have let him see the wound he had inflicted. But silence denied him that satisfaction. Silence cloaked the father's rage, transforming it into something quiet, controlled, lethal. He had learned long ago on job sites and in life that noise is nothing without force. The real danger always comes in the quiet moments just before the hammer swings. He rose from the chair slowly, each movement deliberate, and walked the length of the living room. The clock ticked a steady drumbeat against the stillness, but he didn't rush. He trailed his hand along the back of the couch, past the stack of unpaid bills, past the empty glass left from earlier. His breathing was even steady, though his chest burned with the weight of everything unspoken. The house itself seemed to sense the change in him. The air grew heavier, pressing down on his shoulders. The shadows stretched longer, as if retreating from the storm they could feel gathering. There had been times in his life when he had erupted, when frustration had burst from him like fire, leaving scars in its wake. But this was different. This silence was intentional, calculated, the kind of quiet a man carries when he knows that words are wasted and actions must speak instead. He moved to the window and stared out at the street, where a stray cat slinked across the pavement, disappearing into the dark. The world outside continued as if nothing had changed. But inside these walls the balance had shifted forever. His son's cruelty had lit a fuse, but he would decide when the explosion came. Until then, silence was his weapon. He thought of storms he had weathered on rooftops during his working years. Rain pounding so hard it blurred his vision. Wind strong enough to rip shingles from his hands. The silence in those moments had always been eerie, a pause between gusts when the air itself seemed to inhale. That was where he lived now, in that breathless pause, gathering strength, waiting for the inevitable break. The weight of the betrayal pressed on him, but instead of crushing it, solidified him. He turned from the window, his footsteps slow but steady, echoing softly across the hardwood floor. Each sound was precise, deliberate, like the ticking of the clock, controlled, inevitable. He lowered himself back into his chair, folding his hands in his lap, the picture of calm. But behind his eyes the storm surged. His silence unsettled even him, for he knew what it meant. It meant he was past pleading, past questioning, past the fragile hope that things might change on their own. Silence meant decision. He let it stretch on minute after minute, until the house itself seemed to bend under the weight of it. The refrigerator hummed, the pipes groaned, and still he said nothing. The stillness was almost unbearable, yet he clung to it, feeding on its strength. Somewhere in the back of his mind he imagined his son's face, if he could see him now, calm, composed, unreadable. That mask of silence would unnerve him more than shouting ever could. His son had expected fury, an outburst, a broken man railing against the cruelty of his own blood. But he would get none of it. Instead, he would face something colder. The silence deepened, the kind of quiet that carries weight, that promises something unseen but inevitable. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the darkness behind his lids sharpen his thoughts. He pictured every insult, every sacrifice, every betrayal, each one folding neatly into place like pieces of a blueprint. The rage was still there, but it was no longer wild. It was harnessed, channeled, waiting for release. The house seemed smaller now, the walls closing in heavy with the unsaid. It was the kind of silence before a storm breaks, when the sky bruises purple and the air tastes of metal, when every living thing holds its breath because it knows what's coming. He exhaled slowly, eyes opening, the lines of his face etched deeper in the dim light. The storm inside him was no longer something to fear. It was something to wield. And when it finally broke, it would leave nothing the same. What he planned to do next would not only shatter the silence, but rewrite the story his son thought he controlled. He moved through the dark hallway with the same quiet precision he had carried all evening, each step measured, each breath deliberate. The house seemed to hold its own breath as he reached the study door. He paused with his hand on the knob, fingers curling around the brass handle polished smooth by years of use. For a moment he remembered all the nights he had sat inside that room balancing checkbooks, signing tuition checks, writing letters of support. That room had always been a place of sacrifice, the engine that powered his son's life forward. Tonight it would become something else entirely. The door creaked softly as it opened, and he entered, the faint smell of old paper and leather filling his lungs. Moonlight spilled through the blinds, striping the desk with pale silver. He crossed the room and pulled open the bottom drawer, the one that stuck slightly from years of wear. Inside lay the files, folders thick with documents, neat stacks of bank statements, envelopes marked with his precise handwriting. He reached for the blue folder at the top, the one that held the future his son thought belonged to him. The fund. The promise. The lifeline meant to buy a new house. He sat down, the chair groaning under his weight, and placed the folder in front of him. For a long moment he simply stared at it, his hands resting flat on the desk. This was supposed to be his son's safety net, the fruit of decades of sacrifice. He had planned it carefully, dollar by dollar, carving out a portion of his life so that his son would never struggle the way he had. But now, in the shadow of betrayal, the folder looked less like a gift and more like a weapon, one he alone could control. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the numbers. Rows of balances stared back at him, figures that had once filled him with pride. He had built this quietly while others slept, while others spent. He had said no to vacations, no to upgrades, no to comfort, all so his son could have this. He traced the ink with his finger, his mind colder now, calculating. Every number was a reminder of nights he came home too exhausted to eat, mornings he dragged his body back to work before dawn, all of it condensed into lines on a page. His jaw tightened as he reached for the pen resting in its holder. He gripped it so hard his knuckles whitened. A father's promise was supposed to be sacred. He had sworn he would provide no matter what. But promises, he realized, are not eternal. They are conditional, built on trust, and that trust had been shattered. His son had broken something deeper than any contract could name, and so he would break this promise in return. He began to write, his handwriting steady, precise, stripping away the commitment that had once defined him. His eyes were cold, his movements controlled. There was no hesitation, no flicker of doubt. The silence of the study grew heavier, as if the walls themselves understood the gravity of what was unfolding. With every stroke of the pen, he severed the lifeline his son had taken for granted. He was no longer the giver, no longer the man who bent himself in half to make another man's life easier. He was reclaiming his power. The folder lay open, the decision etched in ink, irreversible. He set the pen down and leaned back, exhaling slowly. The storm that had been building in him all night had found its outlet not in shouting or fists, but in this simple, devastating act. A promise erased, a future rewritten. He looked at the papers one last time, his eyes narrowing. His son would never see it coming. He thought he had secured everything, that his father's devotion was unshakable. But tonight proved otherwise. He closed the folder and slid it back into the drawer, the thud of wood against wood, final and absolute. Then he locked it, slipping the small brass key into his pocket. His fingers brushed against the fabric as he withdrew his hand, and for the first time that evening, a faint smile ghosted across his lips. It wasn't joy, not satisfaction. It was something colder, a recognition that the balance of power had shifted. His son had spoken words meant to wound, but it was the father who held the knife, now sharpened by silence, steadied by betrayal. He stood and walked to the bookshelf, pulling down an old ledger, flipping through its yellowed pages, until he found the records of past sacrifices, loans, paid debts, cleared tuition bills stamped in red as completed. He ran his hand over the faded ink as if acknowledging the weight of his own history. Those sacrifices were done. They had been real, but they were finished. The ledger closed with a snap, the sound sharp in the still air. The clock on the wall struck midnight, the chime echoing through the house. He extinguished the desk lamp and stood in the dark, the moonlight painting his silhouette across the floor. His hand brushed the surface of the desk one last time, a quiet farewell to the man he had been before this night. Then he turned and left the study, closing the door softly behind him. The silence returned thicker than ever, but now it was no longer a burden. It was armor. The house seemed to vibrate with it, as if the storm inside him had seeped into the very walls. He walked back through the hallway, his steps lighter, his mind clear. The decision had been made, and with it came a calm, sharper than any rage. He reached the living room and stood in the doorway, staring at the empty chair where he had sat earlier, consumed by humiliation. That man was gone. The father who bent to betrayal, who drowned in shame, had been replaced by someone far more dangerous. Someone who could wait, who could watch, who could strike when the time was right. He moved to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see the quiet street outside. The world slept, unaware of the storm taking shape inside the house. His reflection stared back at him in the glass eyes, hard lips pressed into a thin line. The decision was final, and what followed would change everything. What his son thought was guaranteed had just been ripped from under him, and he wouldn't know it until it was far too late. The pen hovered above the page for a long moment, the silence so complete that he could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall, the occasional creak of the house settling around him. His chest ached, not from exhaustion this time, but from the weight of what he was about to do. He blinked hard, and a single tear broke loose, falling onto the edge of the paper. It spread in a small, dark circle, staining the page like an ink blot he hadn't intended. For a second he almost hesitated, almost let the emotion pull him back from the edge. But the cold certainty that had been building all night overtook the grief, hardening into resolve. His hand steadied. The pen touched down. The scratch of ink across paper was louder than it should have been, sharp and final. Each stroke stripped away the promise that had once defined him, every line another cut, severing him from the man who gave without question. He signed his name slowly, deliberately, pressing harder than necessary, carving the letters into the paper as though engraving them onto stone. When he finished, the silence felt different. It no longer smothered him. It crowned him. The act was simple, but it carried the weight of revolution. He leaned back, exhaling through clenched teeth, his eyes burning from the force of tears he refused to shed. The pain was still there, deep, raw, the kind that twists in the gut and leaves scars invisible to the eye. He would never stop grieving the fracture in the bond he once believed unbreakable. But alongside the pain was something sharper, something cleaner. A strange calm born not from acceptance, but from control. He had been reduced, humiliated, betrayed. But in this moment, he took that humiliation and reshaped it into something his son could never see coming. The papers lay before him, edges slightly curled from the pressure of his hand. He studied them, his gaze unflinching, as though daring the ink itself to defy him. The decision was irreversible. His son's future, the one he thought secure, had been rewritten with a few strokes of a pen. What once was a gift had now become a secret weapon. The father's lips curled into the faintest suggestion of a smile, not of joy, but of recognition. Recognition that he was no longer the victim of someone else's cruelty. He was the architect of what came next. His hand trembled as he reached for the folder, not from weakness but from the adrenaline coursing through him. He slid the signed papers inside, shut the folder with a sharp snap, and placed it back in the drawer. He locked it again, the metallic click echoing in the quiet room like the seal of a coffin. The key felt warm in his palm. He slipped it into his pocket, fingers brushing the metal as though assuring himself it was real, as though the decision would vanish if he let go. He rose slowly, straightening his shoulders. For the first time in hours, his back felt strong, unbowed. The pain lingered, yes, but it no longer bent him. It propelled him. He crossed the room, the faint sound of his footsteps resonating on the hardwood floor, each one measured, deliberate, like the beat of a war drum leading him into the next phase of battle. At the door he paused, his hand on the frame, and looked back into the study. This room had been the birthplace of sacrifice for decades. Tonight it had birthed something else entirely. As he stepped into the hallway, the air seemed lighter, his lungs freer. He could still feel the sting of betrayal, still taste the bitterness on his tongue, but now it was tempered by the cold edge of certainty. His son thought him broken, thought him weak, thought him disposable. But weakness does not sign away a fortune with steady hands. Weakness does not turn tears into steel. Weakness does not walk out of that room with his head high. He entered the living room once more, the familiar tick of the clock greeting him like an old rival. He stood in the center of the room, staring at the photographs still perched on the mantel. For the first time that night, he did not look at them with longing or grief. He looked at them with detachment, as if they belonged to a life that had ended hours ago. The man in those photos, smiling with his arm around his son, was gone. What remained was someone new, sharper, colder, more dangerous. His eyes shifted to the window where the faint glow of streetlights washed the pavement in yellow. The world outside remained oblivious, its calm masking the storm gathering within him. He pressed a hand against the glass, the coolness grounding him, reminding him of the contrast between the warmth of love and the chill of betrayal. The glass fogged faintly with his breath, and he wiped it away with the back of his hand, leaving a streak that caught the light like a scar. He turned, pacing the room, the rhythm of his steps steady and firm. Each movement was infused with the knowledge that something had changed forever. He was no longer a man waiting for respect or recognition. He was no longer a man crushed by his son's words. He was a man who had made a choice, a man who held the power to shape what came next. His silence had hidden the storm, but his pen had unleashed it. He sat down again, not in defeat, but in command. His body still trembled from the collision of pain and resolve, but now it felt less like weakness and more like energy. He rested his hands on his knees, staring into the shadows, his mind already running ahead, plotting, calculating. His son would never know the exact moment the ground gave way beneath him. He would think himself safe, think himself untouchable, until the truth arrived like thunder after lightning. The father closed his eyes and let the silence stretch again, but this time it was different. It was not the silence of grief or shame. It was the silence of a man who had crossed a line and could never return. The storm inside him had shifted. No longer chaos, no longer torment. It was direction, purpose, inevitability. And as the night deepened and the house settled into its uneasy quiet, he knew that the next move was his. What he would do from this point on would not just reclaim his dignity. It would ensure his son understood the cost of betrayal in ways he could never forget. He sat in the living room, the papers already signed, and locked away the key, pressing against his thigh like a reminder of the choice he had made. The storm inside him had settled into something calmer, colder, a quiet certainty that spread through his veins. He closed his eyes and let his mind wander forward, painting the scene as clearly as if it were unfolding before him. He imagined his son in that shiny new house, the one he had bragged about endlessly, the one his wife had decorated with colors torn straight from glossy magazines. He pictured the fresh paint still carrying that chemical tang, the marble countertops polished to a mirror sheen, the mortgage documents tucked neatly in a folder in the kitchen drawer. His son would be standing there, proud, confident, believing his future was carved in stone. That illusion would not last. He saw the phone ringing, the bank's number glowing on the screen. His son would answer casually at first, expecting routine, perhaps a courtesy call. Then the tone would shift. The voice on the other end would be cool, impersonal, merciless. The funding has been withdrawn. The loan no longer stands. Payments must begin immediately. His son's smile would falter, confusion flashing in his eyes. He would stammer, ask for clarification, insist there must be some mistake. But the voice would not soften. The mistake was his assuming that promises could never be broken. The father's lips pressed into a thin line as he let the vision sharpen. He could see his daughter-in-law hovering in the doorway, a wineglass in her hand, her perfect little world beginning to tilt. She would demand answers, her voice sharp, insistent, cutting through the air. The children, too young to understand, would watch with wide eyes as the walls of their dream began to tremble. The house that was supposed to symbolize success would suddenly feel like a prison, its foundation cracking beneath their feet. He pictured the arguments that would follow, the blame passed back and forth like a poisoned cup. His son's arrogance would crumble, replaced by panic. His wife would accuse him of over-reliance, of naivety, of trusting too much in a man she had always dismissed as old and irrelevant. His son would shout back, desperate, his voice cracking with the realization that he had lost something he thought unshakable. Their perfect life would unravel thread by thread until even the air in that pristine home carried the stench of fear. The father's chest tightened, not with pity, but with recognition. They had broken his heart without hesitation, shattering the trust he had built over a lifetime. Now he would watch their hearts fracture in turn. The symmetry of it was brutal, poetic. He did not smile at the thought. There was no joy in retribution, only inevitability. Justice, cold and precise, does not laugh. It only lands. He imagined his son pacing the polished floors, phone in hand, calling number after number, trying to undo what had already been sealed. He would beg, plead, raise his voice, lower it again, trying every tactic he had ever used to charm or bully his way through life. But every door would close, every avenue blocked. The father had seen to that. His son would finally understand what it meant to be powerless, to have control stripped away in a single stroke of ink. The vision grew darker as he imagined the letters arriving in the mail, each envelope heavier than the last. Notices, warnings, demands. His son's hands trembling as he opened them, his wife looking over his shoulder, her sharp tones slicing deeper with every line she read. The children overhearing fragments, whispers of losing the house, of moving again, of uncertainty. The pride that had once radiated from his son's voice when he spoke of the new home would wither into silence. Conversations would shift to arguments, to blame, to despair. The father leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his eyes unblinking as the images played out. He did not take pleasure in their suffering, but he accepted it as the natural order of things. Betrayal had consequences. Disrespect had costs. The house of dreams was nothing but drywall and deceit, and it deserved to collapse. Just as his heart had cracked under his son's cruelty, so too would their perfect life splinter beneath the weight of reality. In his mind he saw the day the movers would come, carrying out the furniture piece by piece, the walls left bare and echoing. His son standing on the lawn, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow. His wife glaring at him with the kind of contempt that never fades. The children crying quietly, clutching toys they were told they could keep while everything else was loaded onto the truck. The father saw it all as vivid as if he stood across the street watching. And when that day arrived, he would not need to be present. The storm he had unleashed would speak for him. He leaned back in the chair, the cold calm settling deeper into his bones. He did not laugh. He did not gloat. He simply nodded to himself, the gesture sharp, final, like the closing of a coffin lid. Justice had been written into the fabric of the future. His son had thought him powerless, but power was not in noise or anger. Power was in silence, in patience, in the ability to wait until the exact moment when the strike landed hardest. The night stretched on the clock, ticking steadily, each second another step toward the inevitable. He rose, switched off the light, and walked toward the bedroom. His movements were steady, unhurried, the movements of a man who knew he had reclaimed what was taken from him. His heart was still bruised, yes, but it beat with certainty now. The balance had shifted, and his son would soon learn the price of betrayal. And as he lay down staring at the ceiling in the dark, one thought anchored him, colder than sleep, sharper than any dream. The reckoning had only just begun. The night had settled deep, draping the house in a blanket of stillness. He moved slowly onto the porch, lowering himself into the old wooden chair that creaked under his weight. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and the distant hum of traffic. Crickets sang from the wide stretch of yard before him, the steady chorus rising and falling across 40 feet of open ground. He leaned back, letting the sounds wash over him, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the fence line. The world was quiet, but inside him the storm had finally passed. He sat with his hands resting on the arms of the chair, fingers relaxed for the first time that day. There was no triumph in his expression, no joy tugging at the corners of his mouth. Victory was too simple a word, too shallow for what had transpired. What he felt instead was something heavier, a calm edged with sorrow. His dignity had been restored, yes, but it had come at a cost measured not in money or time, but in blood and memory. The bond between father and son had been shattered, and no act, no gesture could piece it back together. The cicadas whined their sound, layering over the crickets, filling the night with a rhythm that reminded him of summer nights long past when his son was still a boy, running barefoot across the yard, fireflies dancing in the dusk. The memory stung sharp and sudden, but he did not flinch. He let it wash through him, acknowledging both its sweetness and the bitterness it now carried. Those days were gone, not stolen, but surrendered to the cruelty of time and choice. He drew a long breath, the cool night air steadying him. He thought of the papers signed and locked away, the final act of defiance that had shifted the balance back into his hands. It was not revenge for the sake of cruelty. It was justice, raw and uncompromising, the only language left when words had failed. His son would learn not through shouting or punishment, but through the weight of consequences he had never believed could reach him. The porch light flickered faintly above moths circling the glow in frantic spirals. He watched them, their fragile wings beating against the glass, and in them he saw something of his son drawn blindly to what glittered, never noticing the danger until it was too late. That realization did not fill him with satisfaction. It filled him with resignation. Some lessons can only be learned through ruin. Some men can only see clearly when everything they took for granted collapses at their feet. His heart still carried the ache of betrayal, but it no longer controlled him. It had transformed into something quieter, something that steadied his pulse rather than quickened it. He reached for the glass of water on the small table beside him, the condensation dripping down onto his palm. He sipped slowly, staring out into the yard, watching the shadows stretch and fold as the moon shifted higher in the sky. The water was cool, grounding, a reminder that life would continue, even if the relationships within it had been burned to ash. The bitterness was there, undeniable. To sit on this porch and know that his own blood had turned against him was a wound that would never fully heal. But woven through the bitterness was release. He had acted. He had reclaimed the part of himself that humiliation had tried to strip away. No longer a victim of his son's cruelty, he sat as a man who had refused to be erased. His silence had hidden the storm, his pen had unleashed it, and now his dignity rested firmly in his own hands. A breeze drifted through, carrying the scent of the earth after a day's heat. He closed his eyes and let it brush against his face, his lips tightening not into a smile but into a line of quiet resolve. Tomorrow would come heavy with its own weight, but tonight he allowed himself to simply be, not triumphant, not broken, just steady. The yard stretched before him, the grass swaying gently under the night's breath. He listened again to the crickets, their steady song a reminder that even after storms the world continues its rhythm. He thought of the house behind him, the walls that had borne witness to his humiliation, his grief, his decision. They would now carry the memory of his reclamation, silent sentinels, to a night that changed everything. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring into the darkness, as if it might answer the questions still lingering in his chest. How had it come to this? How had love turned so bitter, blood so cold? The answers did not come, and perhaps they never would. Some stories are not meant to be explained, only endured. What mattered now was not the why, but the what. The reality that his son would face, the consequences of his choices, and that he, the father, would face his own future with unshaken dignity. The porch creaked as he shifted back in his chair, the sound merging with the night's chorus. He exhaled slowly, the weight of the day settling into his bones. He was tired, yes, but it was the tiredness of a man who had carried his burden to its rightful end. The bitterness would remain a scar carved deep, but alongside it lived a strange freedom. The chains of silence and shame had been broken, replaced by something harder, sharper, but also cleaner. The night deepened, shadows pooling thicker across the yard, the stars pricking the sky with faint light. He tilted his head back, staring at them for a moment, letting the vastness remind him of perspective. Life was bigger than betrayal, longer than pain, stronger than the bonds that had failed him. He had lost a son in one sense, but he had regained himself in another. And that in the end was enough. As the clock inside struck once, the sound muffled through the walls, he knew the story was closing. Not with triumph, not with joy, but with the heavy resonance of truth. He had endured betrayal, humiliation, and grief. He had answered not with rage, but with resolve. And now, on this porch, under the weight of the night, he carried both the sting of loss and the relief of liberation. It was a bitter ending, but endings are seldom sweet. And in that bitterness lay a lesson carved too deep to ignore. Disrespect carries a price, and betrayal is never free. The father sat in silence, listening to the crickets echo across the 40-foot yard, the night pressing in, knowing that justice, cold, unyielding, and final, had been served. Life teaches us that respect within a family is not something given automatically, it must be nurtured and upheld. A parent's sacrifices are not just numbers in a bank account or years of labor. They are pieces of a life devoted to love and responsibility. When that devotion is dismissed or taken for granted, it creates wounds deeper than words can measure. The story of this father reminds us that silence does not mean weakness, and dignity does not vanish simply because others fail to honor it. Sometimes the most powerful lesson comes not from anger, but from standing firm, reclaiming one's worth, and letting consequences unfold. For older generations, this tale is a reminder that age does not erase strength or wisdom, and that even in betrayal, there can be peace found in self-respect. It is never too late to demand the recognition you deserve, and never wrong to protect your dignity when it is threatened. Don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. What life lessons have you carried with you that others should never forget?